Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest edition of the Woke Bros. Of course, I'm your host, Big Wos, joined today by a very special guest as Nando is out on assignment in Mexico City. We decided to get an actual expert up in here. Usually it's just me and Nando up here bloviating, just as talking heads and stammering and yammering dumbasses. I decided I would go out, find somebody who's really learned on a subject that we're pretty engaged on here at the Woke Bros. So I got my partner Fernando Saltiel. He's an assistant professor of economics at McGill University up in the Great North in Canada. Of course, got his PhD here in the good old red, white, and blue at the University of Maryland. My brother Fernando, welcome to the show.
What up, Big Wos? Thanks so much for having me here.
Of course, man. Of course. It's funny because we never called Nando Fernando, so it's kind of funny that
There's two of us. You had to bring in the same name to replace him.
exactly. It's funny that that's your name as well. But before we get into sort of U.S. economic policy and you know Joe Biden's agenda, et cetera, et cetera. How did you get into this racket? How did you figure out you wanted to study economics?
Man, I grew up in Argentina where the economy has been messed up for a long time. So all this talk of inflation always brings me back home. So just growing up, we had economic crisis after economic crisis. So I think I figured out pretty quickly I wanted to get into this, and then I moved to the States and just carried through with this. But to be honest, I never thought I'd be talking about U.S. inflation. So it's good to be out here, drawing on my expertise from back home, which is always good for us.
I love it. And the reason why it's important to talk to you today is because, you know, I feel like there are sort of people that used to be considered, I guess, liberal economics guys, right? Like back in '08, for instance. Those guys were even pretty deficit hawks, inflationary people, scare tactics, X, Y, and Z. But they're not really singing that tune anymore, right? Like you've seen the field in the profession. I'm sure you've noticed move way past that. Specifically, guys who were considered to be on the leftward side of economics. But I think you still see people like fucking Larry Summers come out and be completely panicky and ridiculous about what the economy is doing and just fear mongering about inflation. You mentioned you're from Argentina, where this has been historically an actual problem.
Yeah.
How do you view this thing?
So, admittedly, like when inflation started to pick up a bit earlier in the year, there were some folks who thought this would quickly go away. And so far, seemingly, it hasn't that quickly, right?
Right.
Which just even brought the ones of us who thought like this wouldn't be a major consideration to kind of like reassess what's been going on. There's clearly some fear mongering, right, as to that this might persist for a long time and that this might lead us to take non-optimal, sorry to be so nerdy, but like economic decisions in the moment, right? That could hurt the economy. The main issue that a country like Argentina has had historically is when all of the people who are making decisions basically make it known to everyone else out there that they will not do anything to stop inflation. Right.
Gotcha.
So in Argentina, like every economic actor, like political candidates, a president, like the central bank, like most actors out there, like they've just pretty much given up. I mean, there's some efforts, right? But they're like price freezes where the government basically goes in and tells the supermarket, milk needs to be $1. And the supermarket's like, but I just bought this for $4. It's like, no, it needs to be $1. Well, there's no milk out there, right? And so that's the point that would ideally be avoidable. The U.S. is like a 3 trillion steps away from that, right? And sometimes what you'll hear in the discourse, it seems like that's about to happen tomorrow, right? So it's a matter of having a smarter conversation about like how much of an issue this is. Even if it matters today, will this matter like moving forward? And if it does or if it doesn't, who is it affecting and how much is it affecting different groups of workers, right?
So, it's interesting because Nando talks about it all the time. Like when it comes to monetary policy and stuff like that, the government's not even in charge anymore. We've basically outsourced that to the Federal Reserve, right? We saw at the beginning of the pandemic, they were like, look, we're not going to let the bond market fail. We're going to guarantee US debt to all the debt holders and all the fucking financial institutions around the world. Go ahead, business as usual, right? We saw them step in and be like, nope, we're not letting the economy go to shit. Operate how you need to do it. We're guaranteeing the value of US debt, right? Which theoretically, if this shit got really bad, what would actually stop the Fed from doing something like that for normal people? Meaning, like, we're going to guarantee that shit doesn't get out of control for you guys.
Right, and partly right. That's like the role that the Fed is supposed to play. So, for instance, a concern, and the Fed has played like these mixed roles. So in '08, like the Fed stepped in, like after the crisis and when Obama came in, the Fed stepped in and they implemented very loose like monetary policy. They were like really trying to pump credit into the economy, and you would hear the same inflation hawks who said like inflation is right around the corner, and that did not come to pass, right, at all. Like inflation remained very low to the point, and how you know that inflation remained low, even if you don't know the actual numbers, is that you never heard about it, right? And like when you hear about inflation, like things are going well, right?
Right.
But like to get out of the Great Recession, like the Fed really stepped in big time and like pursued very kind of unconventional monetary policy to try to stimulate the economy. And there was a lot of fear mongering back then that this would happen. So I think when the pandemic started and they pursued very similar policies, a lot of us expected, well, a similar like a similar outcome will end up like taking place. And so far, it hasn't been clear that's going to take place necessarily, because and that's the thing about this crisis. It's not like any other financial crisis. There's like a freaking pandemic going on in the background, right? And that's changing up a lot of variables in the economy. So it's very hard to separate out exactly the relative importance of the different factors that might be driving inflation. So that's what I think a lot of economists are struggling. The ones who are trying to like think about this in a careful way, right? And not just like come out here and just say like the craziest things that they believed going into it. Like a lot of people have these like ideologies and they want to push them along, and now they've seen an opportunity and they want to keep doing that. But even those of us who like want to try to like suss out like what the different like factors matter here, it's like not straightforward, because again, there's a pandemic in the background, right? And it's kind of hard to separate things out.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've mentioned this on the show several times already, I was very amused by this report last week from Bloomberg. And again, Bloomberg is not exactly your liberal bastion of information. We know where Bloomberg's news organization leans, and they put out a report, and it's like, the shit about employment, wage inflation is kind of horse shit, because profits are up across the board 37%. So what do you say to people who are talking about, this stuff where workers have their pick of 90 different jobs and they're getting paid way too much? What do you say to people who are talking about wage inflation as a concept?
If you're trying to argue that American workers or low-wage workers are getting paid too much, like you need to look at any other developed country, right? And like whatever measure you want to use to compare, like low-wage workers in Canada get paid about like 33% more than they do in the US, and most European countries they do too. Like just comparatively, the amounts that I look at for the minimum wages here are significantly higher than they are in the US, right? And even in like provinces out there like Alberta, the minimum wage is significantly higher than it is in a lot of American states, right? And you see this even like the people who make more than the minimum wage have higher salaries. And so something that's actually been interesting is that the rate of wage growth for these low-wage workers in the U.S. has outpaced inflation. So what you kind of end up seeing that's like a little bit different than you would have expected is that these workers in like real terms, right, their wages have increased by about like 7 to 8%, and inflation has been 6%. So their salaries have actually grown more than inflation, these like low-wage workers. So that's good for the economy, because one of the major issues economically in the U.S. in the past 40 years is that low-wage workers have not seen much of the wage growth, right? I'm not saying anything that novel, right? But like any graph you'll see, right? Like it's like the salaries of like the highly educated and the people who are really well off like skyrocketed, but this is not happening at the bottom. So during the pandemic, the opposite's been happening, and that's at least in the way I think about it. I presume you'll agree with me. It's a good outcome for the economy, right? The only question is, for now, the wages of the low-wage workers are increasing and they're beating inflation. But if for some reason that changes and their wages don't rise anymore, maybe next year or 2 years from now, then inflation will really hit these low-income workers. So that's one reason why we still need to be like a bit careful about this, even though the fear mongering and wages increasing for low-wage workers is a good thing for the economy, right? These people are not getting paid sufficiently.
Right.
And I don't see how that's controversial in any case.
And the reason why it's good for the economy, which is something, again, this is something we try to talk about all the time. Like when a low-wage worker gets more money, they put it back in the economy, right? Like they get their hair done. They do all of these different things to all of these different businesses, get their nails done, do this, like everything gets done and they're putting it back. It's not like it's actually stimulating the economy at large. Whereas when these CEOs and these guys get their money, they park it overseas, they put it in their bank account so that whatever, when they die, their fucking spalpeens get the bread untaxed. Like that shit does no good for anybody. Whereas when normal workers get more money, they put more into the economy than these ultra rich people.
Well, and especially in the U.S., additionally, you see, for instance, like childcare is absurdly expensive, right? Like
Right.
housing prices are increasing in large cities. So, for instance, like when I moved out here, I realized like here they have childcare that costs only $7 a day, $7 Canadian a day, which is even cheaper in like U.S. dollars, right? And it's like
Oh,
guaranteed, like your kid will get a slot.
oh,
So it's these kinds of things that you would presume that these normal workers are basically like using like taking advantage of their salary increases to kind of afford like their studio apartment that used to be affordable. So these kinds of increases for workers who haven't seen the gains coming from the growth in the economy taking place over the past 30 or 40 years, like I I don't even know what kind of ideology you'd have to think that that's not a good thing happening in the economy, and that's not the main driver of inflation. Like these workers getting higher salaries, it's not the main contributing factor to what's going on. So
I want to talk
yeah,
about
yeah,
that. So it's obvious, like to me, and when I read people who are obviously a lot smarter and fucking been studying this a lot longer than me, they're like, look, it's we can identify where the inflation is at, right? Like airline tickets, yeah, more people are trying to travel. If you can't travel right now, if like for vacation and you can't afford it, just wait. It'll be fine. You'll be able to travel again. Like that's whatever. That's a lot of the inflation. A lot of it we see in auto manufacturing where we just don't have enough cars to sell to people, which is coming down to like they not making enough chips and like different parts, which seems to me like, well, maybe we should figure out a way to make more chips, right?
yeah.
Like it seems like there are fixes for so many of these things that are afflicting the economy, or even like stuff at the grocery store, which again has a lot to do with supply chain issues of I don't know, start fucking hiring more supply chain people, pay the shit out of them. This shit will start flowing again. It seems like there are obvious fixes. What are you seeing when it comes to the specifics of where the inflation is?
So getting at what you exactly got at, right? Like one of the things that gets mostly talked about is the role of like these like supply chain issues that have been going on kind of worldwide since the pandemic started, right? Like container ships and the like trying to get to California and getting stuck, or like the prices of container ships have gone through the roof, and there's a variety of factors linked to that. Some of which is like some countries like have had lockdowns, right? And it takes like a little while to get started with this like entire supply chain. So then there's shortages, and when there's a shortage, everything things become more expensive. That plays a role. Similar things happen in terms of like trying to hire workers, right? Like warehouse workers used to get paid like $7 an hour or some like terrible salary, right? And now, luckily, they've been able to like get higher salaries. So now some firms are like reluctant to hire warehouse workers, and they haven't adjusted their expectations that now they actually need to be compensated, maybe not fairly, but they need to be compensated more than they were before, right? So some of these factors you would assume that like they're going to get fixed. The supply chain issues, like eventually, right? Like when the pandemic kind of fades, and that's a big part of the issue, right? Like we don't know when this will happen, and I think part of like what Biden's dealing with is like when he came in, we all had the impression like now we have someone who knows what he's doing. This will be done, right? And like then we kind of realized, oh, maybe it's not as easy as we had thought, unfortunately, right? But the supply chain thing, like, will eventually get fixed, and that will drive down inflation. I think the main issue is that the fact that that does not occur immediately creates a lot of anxiety for people, right? Because like this supply chain thing cannot get fixed like overnight. It might take a little
Right.
bit, right? And that's okay. And like if it's just you and I talking about it, like okay, maybe there's a little bit more inflation in the short run, but as long as we all know that this issue will disappear in the long run, then we're fine,
We're
right?
fine. Yeah.
We're fine, right? But the thing is, like, the main consideration here is to try to make sure that people don't freak out to the point that they'll expect
Ah,
for inflation to be higher in the future, because that's when you get into these bad spirals, which is what happens in Argentina. It's like the government predicts that inflation will be 30% next year, but like everyone and their mom knows that it'll be 60%, right? So then you start thinking, okay, it'll be 60%. My boss needs to give me a 60% wage raise, and then so then it just keeps on spiraling. So that's the main thing about trying to bring some calm, that this is mostly a short-term issue, but also trying to ensure that over the long run, this will get sorted out, right?
that's what I was gonna say. Isn't You just perfectly explained why inflation fear mongering is basically a self fulfilling prophecy. It's like inflation will take place if people really, really believe that inflation is taking place, right? Like all of the things that you mentioned, where it's like, all right, let's start hoarding gas, let's start doing this, like, will perpetuate the inflation that we're all afraid of, which is why I'm so confused as to why these people are always doing this panic shit. It almost feels like they have an ulterior motive.
Yeah, and it could be right because at the end of the day, inflation will not be an issue in the U.S. in the long run because like the Federal Reserve will step in and they'll raise interest rates and force a recession if that's what they believe must be done, which is what we're all trying to avoid happens, right? Because forcing a recession or increasing interest rates to force a recession in the middle of COVID does not seem ideal at all. This also coincides with a good moment for workers, right, who are seeing like significant wage increases. So ideally, we can identify and try to explain that part of the issues with inflation are driven by the supply chain issues and these changes in the labor market that we still need to figure out exactly what's going on. And those components will not sustain over the long run. The other thing that's driving up inflation a bit is that all governments across every developed country implemented very large like stimulus packages during the pandemic to try to help out people, right? And that drives up demand, and that's okay. Like that needed to be done during the pandemic, right? Like in Canada, there were like large checks given like as part of like unemployment insurance, and like most countries implemented this. That should not last over the long run, right? Like
Thank you,
hopefully these
President
things.
Trump.
Uh, you know,
Hey,
I
he did sign a check. I don't know.
I got my Biden check. I got my Trump check. It's 50-50. Gotta get rid of it. And haven't gotten a Trudeau check yet, but I'm aiming for one.
We're
So.
working on it.
Uh,
So I did want to get into some of your own personal philosophies as far as economics is concerned, because I feel like Keynesian economics has been very in vogue of recently. Like it's gotten a resurgence, and I would like for you to explain to people what the Keynesian school of economics sort of dictates, the sort of mode of belief in that.
So I think the main consideration in the like a Keynesian framework, let's say, is that the government has a role to play in the economy, right? I think the most common place that you will see this discussed, at least in the macro discussion, is that the government should step in and increase their spending or reduce taxes, or, i.e., in recessions, right? That there's a role for the government to play to stimulate the economy during recessions, and that just lessens the negative impacts of the recession, and then that gets smoothed out over the long run. That's a point of view that was held like by a lot of economists, like very like way back, like before Reagan, let's say, and then it kind of like faded away,
I was
right?
about to say, what happened to that type of thinking?
Until 2008. But I think the Great Recession kind of like brought back these ideas into place a bit more about like the government playing a role in the economy, boosting spending, boosting investment, and especially acting in recessions. And in fact, this is what you saw across the entire developed world. It's not like any government was just like, oh, there's a pandemic happening. Like, too bad. I'm going to do nothing, right? And hope it all gets sorted out.
Of course not, but we know who they did it on behalf of, right? Like, we know who was like, no, we got to step into the economy so that Jamie Dimon is good. Do you know what I mean? Like, like anytime it's in order to save those motherfuckers, government checks, government intervention is never a bad thing. It's great. When the government can help those folks, government handouts, government bailouts, government whatever is awesome. The government steps up with unemployment benefits, insurance. It's like, this is the end of the fucking world, Fernando.
No, and look, that's fair enough, right? I think part of the issue here is that, for instance, the Biden administration took a number of steps to try to help like workers across the spectrum. So there's like, the child tax credit, like trying to help out people. But the thing is, like, these things aren't like visible to people, and like maybe it does help, but like there's like an issue at the end of the day that like, okay, the minimum wage increase, the Biden administration is pushing, it's like $1 an hour, which like isn't anything, but maybe the person will look at the paycheck at the end of the month, it's like an additional $30, right? Which
more
like
now, yeah.
but like that's not enough. Like that hasn't gotten them out of their predicament, right? So all these like small increments, like they come from like explicit government action. Like the government is actively doing something. These like child tax credit, like if you have kids, like we struggle through the pandemic, we're going to help you out. But sometimes these actions are not like clear enough that like can deliver like benefits to people. So that's when this association kicks in, and the people are drawn to like, okay, the government can never help me out, which is too bad, right? Because there are policies that are being put in place, but maybe they're not salient enough for most people. So what I was getting back at you with the Canada thing, right? Like here, everyone knows like you have childcare for $7 a day. and the government is guaranteeing that. So it's like so salient that you can't avoid it. Like if the government hadn't stepped in to deliver childcare for $7 a day, you would not be paying that. And if you ask any of your friends back in the US how much they pay for childcare, you know it's a lot more than $7 a day, right? So that's like an intervention which like it's very clear to everyone. Like the government's here, right, to try like improve the situation.
Try 1,000 a month.
Exactly.
That's damn near standard. The probably the minimum you're gonna pay is
I think that's a minimum.
You understand what I'm saying? Which is again, I ain't no mathematician, but 30 times 7 ain't 1,000. But I do want to get to. Would you say you're to the left of the Keynesian economic belief, or where are you at personally? It seems like you're like, nah, we need to do more.
The thing for me, man, I've been in econ for way too long at this point. So, I'm just like mostly looking to think about like the actions that the governments could take to improve the lives of people mostly, like, I don't know if I have like a philosophy that I adhere by, and there's some like good, there's like some great ideas coming from the left. There's some other ideas that, like, if you look at the data more carefully, like maybe they're not so great, right? And it's not like sloganeering, because some of these policies that in theory should be helping out like low income workers or people who are struggling, like don't end up doing so, right? And unfortunately, sometimes the discourse gets caught up with like what would be like the actual good ideas. And I think what happens is sometimes like the good ideas per se, like just get terrible billing, right? It's like, okay, child tax credit, like no one cares about that. Like, and that's okay. But then it's a matter of
good ideas get terrible billing. The Democratic Party story.
Exactly, right? Like none of these actions, like if you look at them like piece by piece, and it's funny, like you look at surveys, right? And like most people agree with like Biden's economic agenda, even to the left of him. But then when the ideas get implemented, like no one cares, right? The infrastructure package passed. Does anyone like actually care about that? As far as I can tell, like that hasn't shifted opinions, right? So there's like this association, which is like unfortunate because that makes it like a harder sell these ideas, which then in turn makes it clear that the bigger ideas is something that might be of interest to people, right? And that's why these ideas get a lot more attention.
Yeah, and we see it. Look, Donald Trump was perfect at this. He said, "All right, we sending checks out. Put my goddamn name on it."
That's it.
Period.
That's it, man.
He put his name on that money. When
That's right.
Deposited that fucking check in the bank. That shit said Donald Trump on it. Like he understands branding. Like it's like
that's number one Latin American dictator move. Like that. He would have been like perfect. Like most of the countries back home, like would have stayed in power for like 50 years, sending out checks left and right. But then Biden came in, right, and he was going to sign these checks too. And like initially, they were going to have the Secretary of Treasury, or not even like the Undersecretary of Treasury sign it, and no one would have even associated with him. And it was like very like, okay, I don't want to do this, but I'll do it because I'm being told that it is, right. It's like, why isn't that like? You can have politics to go along with the policy. That's okay.
Man, look, I couldn't have said it any better myself. Fernando, man, I really appreciate you coming on. We're gonna have you back, especially when Nando comes back at some point in the future, because you fucking know what you're talking about. Razor sharp. Are you looking forward to the holiday? You got any plans? What's going on?
All right, yeah. Getting back to the US, man. Gonna be back home. Trying to avoid the cold up here, so should be good.
Where in the US will you be at?
Well, DC.
Okay.
Gonna hit up Biden for a bit.
Okay.
Not as nice as you out in California, but
I don't know. He might be in Nantucket with the Rubenstein Carlisle group. So who knows? He might be holidaying with the oligarchs, my brother. But man, thank you so much. Tell the people where they can find you, man.
All right, man. Hit me up on Fernando Saltiel on Twitter, and I'll see you guys around.
Appreciate you. All right, that's our show for today. Make sure you're checking out all the other Count the Dings offerings throughout the week, the mailbag, the Cinephobes, all of the things we got on offer. We'll see you guys next week. We're out of here. Peace.